be our president. And we know Toby. He came to speak to us about his book about the publishing house of Faber and Faber. And that's a really interesting story. He has also written a very interesting book about Stradivarius and the instruments he made and his history. And apart from the learned books requiring a great deal of research, he has produced a thriller, Close to the Edge, which is highly recommended by writers like Val McDermott and our own patron Tracy Chevalier. Quirky, compelling, fascinating, enjoyable, all of those things. So, you know, when you've listened to Toby and his learned talk about Fabergé's eggs, you might want to try your hand at reading his crime novel thriller. Toby, we are delighted that you're here to talk to us tonight. As I say, you have a very enthusiastic audience waiting to hear from you about Fabergé and his fantastic eggs. So over to you, Toby.
Lovely, thank you. And I should say, full disclosure, Tracy did indeed say something nice about one of my books, but it was actually about my Stradivarius book. I noticed, however, that somehow it's got carried over in some of the publicity for the Close to the Edge as well. But Val McDermott did like Close to the Edge, yes. I have written a book about Fabergé, which is why I'm giving this lecture. And I have to admit, I give this lecture quite a lot. The book, this is the book, but I divide the story of the book really into two. And in the first, one of the lectures, I talk about the history of the Easter eggs before the revolution, and then I talk about what happened to them after the revolution. So what you're going to get tonight is before the revolution. And of course, if you like it, you can invite me back. I'll do after the revolution. And I'm actually going to start with a short reading from the beginning of the book, just really to remind ourselves of the importance of Easter to Russian Orthodox Christians. Because, of course, no date in the religious calendar was more important than Easter Day. The long fast of Lent would have been strictly observed. No meat, milk, butter, or eggs for over 7 weeks, until the solemn celebrations of Holy Week built steadily to their joyful climax at a midnight service finishing early on Easter morning. Throughout the day itself, friends and family greeted each other with the traditional 3 kisses and responded to the jubilant "Christ is risen" with a reply of equal certainty, "He is risen indeed." And then, in a ritual whose symbolism stretches back to pagan spring festivals, they would exchange eggs. So Tsar Alexander III was simply following tradition when, for Easter 1885, he gave his beloved Tsarina, the popular Marie Feodorovna, an apparently unexciting white enameled egg. About 2.5 inches high, it had the size and appearance of a large duck egg, but with a gold band around its middle. Only when the Empress opened the Tsar's present did it reveal its true nature. Like an elaborate Matryoshka doll, it contained a perfect yolk made of gold. Within that was a golden hen, sitting on a nest of golden straw. And inside the hen was a diamond miniature of the imperial crown, concealing a tiny ruby pendant. It was the first egg made by Carl Fabergé for the Russian court. And as we'll see, that was going to spark a tradition that each year the Tsar would give his wife an Easter present from Fabergé. And I'll be showing you many more pictures of eggs in the rest of this talk. But before I do that, I just want to talk about some of the characters I'm going to be talking about as well. So first of all, the recipient of that egg, Marie Feodorovna. She's sitting down there in that photograph. And no surprise that their father, with these 5 royal children, each ruling their own different country or empire, was called the father of Europe. And here's Marie Feodorovna now standing at the back, but this time with our Russian family. So sitting in the middle there, you've got the Tsar who gave her that Easter present, Tsar Alexander III, famously strong, a great bull of a man. There are all sorts of great stories about his strength. The one I particularly like is the story of him meeting the Austrian ambassador at a time when tensions are rising between Austria and Russia. And the Austrian ambassador says that Austria is thinking of moving its divisions, moving its army into the Carpathian Mountains on the Russian border. Tsar Alexander III takes a silver ruble between his thumb and forefinger, bends it in 2, and says, "This is what I will do to your divisions." You can say many bad things about Alexander III, but one of the good things you can say about him is that actually alone among all the Romanov Tsars, he did not lead Russia into any foreign wars. And there you see them, of course, surrounded by their family. So standing at the front there is the Grand Duchess Olga, born in the purple, that is to say, born when her father was already Tsar. She didn't die until the 1960s, by which time she was living on a farm in Canada. I'll talk a lot more, of course, about Nicholas standing at the back there, the last Tsar, and I'll talk a little bit more about Prince George, who you see sitting on the right-hand side there. Now, there's an interesting exchange of letters between the Tsar, Alexander III, and his brother about that first egg that I just showed you. Because his brother Vladimir has gone to pick up the egg for him from Fabergé's shop in St. Petersburg, and then delivers it to the Alexander, along with instructions for how to make the egg work. And Alexander says to his brother, "Thank you, dear Vladimir, for going to all this trouble on my behalf. I do hope the egg has the desired effect on its recipient." And that, of course, leads you to wonder what was the desired effect on its recipient. And to understand that, I think it's worth just spending a little bit more time understanding how Alexander had come to the throne, because he had come to the throne in really the bloodiest circumstances unimaginable. His father, Alexander II, had been the Tsar liberator, the Tsar who had freed the serfs, who was moving Russia onto a gradual process of reform. And then in 1881, his carriage had been going through the streets of St. Petersburg when a bomb was thrown at it. No one was hurt. He got down from the carriage to check that no one was hurt. And that's when the second bomb was thrown. And he was almost literally blown up. He was still alive as he was carried into the Winter Palace, dripping blood up the stairs, but he died a couple of hours later. And at that moment, of course, his son, Alexander III, became Tsar. And perhaps not surprisingly, called a halt to the process of reform. Alexander III was scared that he and his family would suffer the same fate as his father. And he responded to that fear in a number of ways. He basically turned Russia into a police state. He himself referred to Russia as a prison. He only really felt free when it was beyond its borders. He moved his family away from St. Petersburg to this vast palace that I'm showing you a picture of here, Gatchina, about 10 or 15 miles outside St. Petersburg, where, although it's huge, they lived on a mezzanine floor whose ceilings were so low that he had to bend his head, apparently. And they were surrounded by guards, patrols every 100 yards, a very sort of isolated and unpleasant existence, really, under the threat of assassination, taking Marie, his wife, away from the balls and parties of St. Petersburg, which she had loved, obviously making life quite difficult for her. I think it's fair to say that she probably wasn't much enjoying being Tsarina in the early 1880s. So I think it's fair to suppose that that first egg was simply designed to amuse her, something to take her away from herself for a while. And it clearly succeeded, because it would spark this tradition that each year the Tsar would give his wife an Easter present from Fabergé. Now, there aren't many surviving Easter eggs from, one other person I should introduce at this stage is Carl Fabergé himself. Here he is, the picture taken in later life. I think you can understand from this picture why younger visitors to the shop might confuse him with Father Christmas. And what he's doing in this picture is he's sorting through stones. Now, that's about as close as Carl Fabergé ever got to making a piece of jewelry himself. Carl Fabergé was not some lone craftsman working alone in a garret making his treasures. He was the head of a large and very successful multinational jewelry empire. The Fabergé organization would come up with the designs, source all the materials for the items to be made, and sell the finished products in their shops. But in terms of the actual manufacture, the actual construction, well, that was subcontracted. Sometimes to workshops within the Fabergé organization, each one presided over by a workmaster who would take the real responsibility for producing things, or if it was a specialist piece of work, to the appropriate specialist subcontractor. Over 1,000 people worked for Fabergé one way or another in this organization. In 1900, it moved into its own purpose-built headquarters in St. Petersburg. This is the shop on the ground floor, and you can read the contemporary accounts. You would go into that shop and a piece of Fabergé would be unveiled for you. You would be allowed to buy it. It wouldn't be sold to you, nothing so vulgar as that. And then on the floors above, this is the design studio. You can see all the windows on the left there to let all the light in. And then here is one of those workshops, as I say, each one presided over by a workmaster, where I suppose you could say the real action took place. I don't know if you've ever been into a modern jeweler's workshop, but what strikes me when I do is how very similar they still look. Jewelers still often sit in these little booths that you see here, surrounded by their tools. Now, I don't know how well you've got this on your screen, but you might just see that these two gentlemen here, I'm pointing out with my mouse, are staring very intently at an egg-shaped object. And when this photograph was first discovered, people spent a lot of time trying to work out which of the Fabergé imperial Easter eggs it was they were looking at. And then the object itself came up for sale. It turns out to be nothing to do with Easter at all. It's an engagement present from a Rothschild to another Rothschild, but it is actually the last Fabergé egg of any description to have come up for sale, for public auction, I should say. That was in 2008, I think, 2007 perhaps. It sold for $18 million. So in terms of a public price for a Fabergé egg, and not even a Fabergé imperial Easter egg, that is the last recent public price we have. Now, I mentioned there aren't many surviving eggs from the early years. What we do have, in fact, surviving from the early years are not the eggs themselves, but lots of correspondence about them. Correspondence going back and forth between Fabergé and the imperial cabinet about the design for next year's eggs. And it's fair to say that in this early period, you don't really see Fabergé yet having his autonomy as a designer. And I think that's part of the reason why we don't have many eggs surviving from these early years, because they're not so obviously personal in the way later eggs would be. In fact, the only other egg we have surviving from the first 5 years is this one from 1887. I think it's always worth reminding you, by the way, how small Fabergé eggs are. And I'll do that periodically in this lecture. So just remember, this object is only about 2 or 3 inches high. They are a lot more jewel-like, really, than you might think when you see these large objects blown up on your screen. Now, we've already got more elaborate, of course, from that hen egg that I started with. We've got a surprise inside, a clock that you can see there, made by Philippe Vacheron. But there's still nothing there that makes it particularly personal to the Tsarina. You can perhaps understand why this egg was in the West for a long time without anybody realizing it was a Fabergé imperial Easter egg. You can perhaps even understand why an American was able to buy it at an upmarket flea market about 5 years ago for what was essentially its scrap value, for $13,000. He paid $13,000 for it, and he was hoping to make a small turn by selling it on to somebody who would melt it down for the gold and diamonds that it contains. Luckily for that American, he'd overpaid slightly. He couldn't make a turn on his $13,000 investment. So he did a little bit of research, and came onto all this these internet articles where people knew that this egg had been sold in America in the early 1960s and now knew it was a Fabergé egg. He got in touch with Wartskis, who are the great London dealers in Fabergé, who were associated with that research. A man from Wartskis came over and authenticated it for him. Nobody knows what they sold it for. They already had a buyer lined up, and it was a private sale. But the rumoured price is £20 million. So $13,000 to £20 million beats anything you get on Antiques Roadshow, I would say, these days. But as I say, that's the only other surviving egg from the first 5 years. And then what you see is you no longer see the correspondence between Fabergé and the imperial cabinet. You see essentially Fabergé starting to get his autonomy as a designer. Autonomy subject to 3 conditions. First, naturally enough, that each year's Easter present should be egg-shaped. Secondly, that each one should contain a surprise, something within it to amuse and delight the empress like that first egg had. And thirdly, that each egg should be different, that there should be no repetition of theme from egg to egg. And it's that last requirement that starts to drive the most wonderful creativity in Fabergé and his designers, as they struggle each year to come up with a design that might be different from the previous years. And often what they do in that struggle is they start thinking about what's going on in the lives of the emperor and the empress at the time. And what that means is we can start to see the Fabergé eggs as this totally quirky, one-sided history, illustrated history, of what turns out to be the decline of the Romanovs. And that's the story I'll try to bring out in the rest of this talk. So this is the next surviving egg from 1890. Remember how small they are? And what you're seeing here is an example of Fabergé's enamel work. And Fabergé's enamel really is amazing. And you touch this enamel. I've never actually touched an egg, but I've touched other items of Fabergé enamel. And you really can feel the sort of velvety smoothness of it. Now, enameling is a very tricky job to get right. It involves applying powdered glass to the metal surface that you're enameling at a temperature of about 600 degrees centigrade, so it will fuse onto the surface. If the surface you're enameling is curved, then there's all sorts of potential for it to go wrong as that enamel cools. What you're seeing here on this particular piece are 6 separate layers of enamel, 5 of them transparent, 1 opaque, to give this wonderful sort of opalescent look you're getting from this egg. And you can just see on this egg, and you'll see better examples in later ones. This is an example of guilloche technique. That's where a design has been etched onto the metal before the enamel is applied. And Fabergé, of course, had, that was an old technique, but Fabergé had access to machine tools for his guilloche work. And that means that you get the most wonderful symmetrical designs etched onto the metal of many of his eggs under the enamel. You can just see here towards the top there, the little sort of fleur-de-lis type crosses almost towards the top of the egg there. Now, this egg is called the Danish Palace's egg. Why is it called the Danish Palace's egg? Well, because of its surprise. Folded up inside that egg are these tiny little postage stamp miniatures of, as the name of the egg describes, suggests, palaces. Partly palaces, Danish palaces, which Marie Feodorovna would have known growing up as a Danish princess. Partly also Russian palaces that she was by now living in as wife of the Tsarina. In fact, towards the right on that there, you've got another corner view of Gatineau. I don't know if you can see it on your screen. And at either end of that line of 12 miniatures, you've got a different sort of Russian royal residence. You've got the Russian royal yacht, which the family used to go for summer cruises. So this is what you start to get from the eggs. Both a picture of the opulence in which Marie Feodorovna had grown up, but then of the unimaginable wealth she was by now enjoying as wife of the Tsar. The following year, we get a totally different egg. So that last egg was enameled. This one is a different jewelry technique. It's carved from semi-precious stone, from bloodstone, which is the semi-precious stone you see of the egg. And there you can see sitting outside it is the surprise that gives this egg its name, the Memory of Azov egg it's called. And that miniature there is a miniature of a boat, the Memory of Azov. Entirely appropriate Easter present for Marie Feodorovna to receive for Easter 1891, because at that time, both her eldest sons, Nicholas and George, were off sailing on the Memory of Azov, on the original of this miniature. Nicholas, of course, is going to be Tsar one day, and so his parents thought it was a good idea for him to start making diplomatic connections with some of Russia's neighbors. So he joined this boat as it cruised around from Egypt via India and Singapore to Tokyo in Japan. And George had started to develop a rather alarming cough, and his parents thought it might be a good idea for him to spend a voyage in southern climes like this. I have to say that as purposes for the voyage, both turned out to be abject failures. For Nicholas, the voyage had ended, as I said, in Japan, when he was actually attacked by a samurai wielding a sword who hit him in the head. He suffered headaches for the rest of his life. Apparently, he had looked rather too enthusiastically at the samurai's wife. And that gave Nicholas a view of the Japanese, which persisted really for the rest of his life. So yes, poor old Prince George. As I say, never went back to St. Petersburg. He lived out the rest of his rather short life in the Caucasus, down in the south of Russia, so away from the awful winters of St. Petersburg. And that's what you get being commemorated in this egg here from 1893. And actually, of all the eggs I'm going to show you, this is probably the most blingy. It's the most gem-encrusted, most vulgar, you might almost say. Except it's also probably the most poignant, because at the top of that egg is a flat cut. It's all about Prince George, basically. At the top of that egg is a flat cut so-called portrait diamond. And you look down to the top of that and you see a little miniature of Prince George. And then each of those lozenges around the outside of the egg, they actually spell out the date, 1893. But so there are 4 of them. They open, and each of them reveals a little image there of the hunting lodge in the Caucasus, where Prince George was by now living this rather lonely exile. So actually, in this egg, you get something terribly poignant, I think, between the juxtaposition between the opulence of the egg itself and the relative simplicity of the life that George is living down in the Caucasus. The following year, I need to introduce a new character now. Here she is, Princess Alix of Hesse, famously beautiful. Nicholas had been in love with her for years, and in 1894, his parents finally gave him permission to ask for Alix's hand in marriage. Alix loved Nicholas back. Nevertheless, the courtship wasn't smooth. As a German princess, she had grown up a devout Lutheran. She found it hard to imagine converting to Russian Orthodoxy, which would, of course, have been required of her as the wife of the future Tsar. But she did eventually come round to it after about 3 weeks, and then embraced Russian Orthodoxy with all the fervour of the convert. Here they are, the young, handsome couple. But there was a reason why Nicholas had been given permission to ask for Alex's hand in marriage by his parents. And that reason is that it had become clear in the course of 1894 that Tsar Alexander III, this great bull of a man, was in fact dying. He had kidney disease. So Nicholas was able to bring Alex back to Livadia in the south of Russia, where Alexander was by then living, introduce her to her putative father-in-law, but Alexander died only about 2 weeks later. And then Nicholas and Alex returned to St. Petersburg, to a city in mourning, for him to take up his role as Tsar. And they got married a couple of weeks later in a city in mourning. And in the moment they got married, she ceased being Princess Alex of Hesse, and she became Alexandra Fedorovna, which is how I will refer to her from now on. Now, this, of course, is a sad story. But from the point of view of the story I'm telling about the Fabergé eggs, it's actually rather good news, because Nicholas wasn't going to stop giving a Fabergé egg each year to his mother. But of course, he's got a wife of his own now to give one to. So from having only one egg each year to talk about, I now have two. And here is the first egg that Alexander received for Easter 1895. It's called the rosebud egg, naturally enough. You can see why. There's a little rosebud that sits inside it as a surprise. Now, I've already waxed lyrical about Fabergé's enamel, and you might be looking at that egg and thinking the enamel on that egg isn't very special. And if so, you'd be right. And that's because this egg has been extensively restored after it was damaged when it was used as a missile in a marital argument, not between Nicholas and Alexandra, I hasten to add, but a future owner of the egg. Now, you might just see down the bottom of that rosebud, there's a little golden knob. And you turn that knob and the petals of the rosebud open up and used to reveal inside a crown and a pendant. Now, this picture here is black and white because some point since coming to the West, this egg has lost its crown. The equivalent picture I showed you, of course, for Marie Fedorovna's egg was also black and white for the same reason. Both these eggs have lost their crowns. You don't have to look terribly far to see the parallels between what happened to the eggs and what happened to their owners, I'm afraid to say. Now, I'm just going to pause for a while, well, not really pause, but concentrate for a while on talking about the eggs for Marie Fedorovna, because it's quite clear that Fabergé never had any trouble coming up with ideas for eggs for Marie Fedorovna. There are all sorts of themes he could mine. He also knew her taste. They were the same age. They liked the same sort of things. She was famously a very outgoing person, easy to get to know, easy to know what she would like. And as I say, there were all sorts of themes that Fabergé could mine. One obvious theme, of course, was to memorialize her husband. So here, for example, is the Alexander III equestrian egg. What you've got here is an egg carved of rock crystal. So this very pure quartz. It looks like glass, but this is actually carved crystal. And sitting inside that egg, well, it's not much of a surprise this time because you can see it through the egg, but it is this golden miniature of a famous equestrian statue of Alexander III. It used to stand in one of the main squares in St. Petersburg, and I think you can probably even see from that miniature why that statue used to have the nickname the Hippo. Then you have another part of Marie Fedorovna's being. She took very seriously the idea that her role as mother of the Tsar was to be mother of the nation. And in her role as mother of the nation, she was patron of over 100 different institutions, schools, hospitals, orphanages, that sort of thing. And that's what you see being commemorated in this egg from 1898, the pelican egg. You may know this idea that the pelican is a symbol of motherhood because of the idea, it's a myth, but there is this idea that in extremis, the mother pelican will feed her young with her own flesh. So that leads to the pelican being a symbol of motherhood. And here you see the pelican in her nest sitting on top of the egg. But the wonderful thing about this egg is the egg itself unfolds to reveal this whole series of miniatures within the egg. Each one a picture of a different education institution of which Marie Fedorovna was patron of. You've got 8 of them here, but there were, as I say, over 100 to choose from. Or you've got the eggs that you can really only describe as great fun. Here's the swan egg from 1903. Whenever I look at this, I just think how modern it looks, really. The smoothness of that enamel and the rock crystal base on which the egg is standing. And you can see there the swan that sits inside the egg and gives it its name. But the wonderful thing about this swan is its clockwork. So it actually swims around that little pool of aquamarine, nodding its head and flapping its wings, I think, as it does so. Here's another one from a couple of years later, the peacock egg. There's a famous peacock clock in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, which clearly inspired this egg. But Fabergé has taken that idea and taken it to a different place. So here, again, you have an egg carved from rock crystal. Sitting inside on golden branches is this peacock. But as you can see, you can open the egg, lift out the peacock, and again, that peacock is clockwork. And this time it struts around, fanning out its tail feathers as it does so. The last one of these I'll show you is this one from 1911, the bay tree egg. So wonderful piece of carving this. I mean, this is carved from nephrite, these individual bay leaves that you're seeing here. And you can also see the little enamel flowers and jewel fruits dotted around that bay tree as well. One of them is a knob. You turn that knob and a flap opens in the roof of the bay tree, and up pops a little bird singing a little song. It just is all great fun. Alexandra Fedorovna, on the other hand, was a very different sort of customer. And I show this particular picture to remind ourselves that she was in many ways the archetypal Victorian, very literally in one sense, and that she was Queen Victoria's granddaughter. By all accounts, in fact, she was her favorite granddaughter. And here she is showing off her first daughter, Olga, to Olga's great-grandmother, with Nicholas and future Edward VII standing behind them there. But also Victorian in her attitudes, really. She had a very different view from Marie Fedorovna of what it was to be an empress. As I say, Marie Fedorovna was approachable, easy to get to know. Alexandra thought an empress should be grand, should be distant, should be hard to get to know. And that obviously made her a more difficult person for Fabergé to produce eggs for. And you really do see Fabergé struggling in the first few years of her husband's reign. So that first egg, of course, was the rosebud egg. The next year, really, he produces an egg for her that is basically a copy of an idea he's already had for Marie Fedorovna. Because what you've got here is an egg carved from rock crystal, but inside it are miniatures. Miniatures which are pictures of palaces. Palaces in Darmstadt and Hesse, where Alexandra had grown up as Princess Alex. Also palaces in St. Petersburg, where she is by now living as wife of the Tsar. So in that sense, we're sort of copying the idea in the Danish palace's egg. But as you can see, we are copying it in a totally different, totally wonderful way. Particularly because that jewel, that cabochon jewel you see on the top there, is actually a knob. So you can turn that jewel, and down comes a little hook, and it turns the pages inside this egg. It's actually called the revolving miniatures egg. So it's just a wonderful piece of work. Or what you see Fabergé doing is turning to the great events of Nicholas's reign for themes for Alexandra's egg. So this is the one from the following year, from 1897. So this is the coronation egg. And what you've got there is the egg itself with this fabulous starburst guilloche beneath the enamel, and sitting inside it, I'll actually show how it sits inside it, is this wonderful miniature of the coronation coach. And you see that in the flesh. And although, of course, you're not allowed to touch it, you can almost feel the springiness of the suspension. It's a wonderful piece of work, that coach. It took the jeweler who made that coach was only 22. He had to be that young because he had to have eyes good enough to work at that level of detail. And he took him 18 months. It was that much work. So it's a fabulous egg, this. For many people, this is one of Fabergé's masterpieces. But I have to say that by the time Alexandra received this egg for Easter 1897, I'm pretty sure the coronation is one of the last things she wanted to remember, because it had been a famously disastrous affair. Now that coach, as I say, miniature of the coronation coach, in which Alexandra had ridden through the streets of Moscow. I should say that at this stage, St. Petersburg was very much Russia's capital, but Moscow was its ancient capital and was still where Tsars went to be crowned. So that was still where the coronation took place. So her coach had been one of three riding through the streets of Moscow. The first one was Marie Fedorovna. She took precedence as mother of the Tsar. Huge cheers for her. She was a popular woman. Next came Nicholas's coach. Slightly more muted cheers for him. He was still a bit of an unknown quantity. Then Alexandra's coach, deathly silence. She was already seen as the unpopular German interloper. That was bad enough. What was really bad was what happened the next day. Now, it was traditional the day after the coronation for the Tsar to go to greet his Muscovite subjects at this field outside Moscow called Kudinka Field. It had been going on for generations, this idea. The thing is that in the dozen or so years since Alexander had been crowned, Moscow's population had grown hugely. Russia was industrializing. The authorities were unprepared for the number of people who turned up at Kudinka Field to greet their Tsar. Now, they hadn't just come to meet the Tsar, they'd also come on the promise of some beer and a tankard to put it in. And at one point, a rumor went around that there wasn't enough beer, and there was a stampede. Now, the estimates of the number of people killed range from the official 200 or 300 to the unofficial 2,000 or 3,000. Either way, it was a demonstration of incompetence, that these people couldn't even control a crowd. What made it even worse was Nicholas and Alexandra's reaction. You've got to remember, of course, that the states are still terribly young. Nicholas is only 25. He takes bad advice from his uncles, and that night he and Alexandra do not go to visit the injured in hospital. Instead, they go to the French ambassador's ball, thereby giving themselves a reputation for callousness they struggled to shake off, really, for the rest of Nicholas's reign. So it's a lovely egg, but I'm not sure Alexandra wanted to be reminded of it, as I say. How much she must have preferred the egg she received the following year. This one, the lilies of the valley egg. And you can see why it's called that. These lovely lilies of the valley that hang off the side of the egg. They're actually miniature pearls. For a start, the design of this egg, well, it's the Art Nouveau style, of course, very much style that Alexandra liked. She decorated her palaces in the Art Nouveau style. So already she's liking this egg. And then you might just see that one of these pearls on the outside of the egg is actually a knob. You turn that knob, and up fan from the egg, pictures of the three people that Alexandra undoubtedly loved most in the world, Nicholas and their two daughters who had been born by then, Olga and Tatiana. Olga was a very domestic, very loving, Alexandra was a very domestic, very loving mother. I'm sure that if Fabergé had carried on producing eggs for her that contained pictures of her children and of her family, she would have been happy. And yet we don't see any more pictures of the children in eggs for many years to come. And it's not very hard to see why, actually. So you've got Olga and Tatiana here, next to Maria Anastasia, 4 girls all in a row. Now, this was a problem because in only having girls, Nicholas and Alexandra were having a huge dynastic problem. Catherine the Great's son had hated his mother so much that when he became Tsar, he put in place a law that said no woman could ever again sit on the throne of Russia. So these daughters, much loved as they were, could not inherit the throne. You then look at the rest of Nicholas's family. Well, he had 2 brothers. George by now has sadly died. There's one other brother, Michael, who the moment he thinks he might be in line for the throne, marries his commoner mistress in a morganatic marriage, thereby disqualifying himself from the throne. You then look at Nicholas's cousins, all these reprobate Grand Dukes, none of them suitable. So in only having daughters, Nicholas and Alexandra were having a huge problem. It would have been the height of bad manners, I think, for Fabergé to carry on reminding the family of these daughters and producing them in pictures of the eggs. And as I say, you don't see pictures of the children for many years to come. Instead, you see Fabergé continuing to struggle. Here are 2 eggs presented to Alexandra, one towards the end of the 19th century, and one, as you can see, in 1901. I think the one on the right there, which is called the basket of flowers egg, well, it is rather lovely, I think. The one on the left there, I think, is rather ugly as opposed to lovely. But either way, they're not very personal. There's nothing there that really speaks of these as Fabergé eggs. And in fact, the current owner of the basket of flowers egg, the one on the right there, is Her Majesty the Queen. But for years, nobody realized that was a Fabergé egg. Or again, you see Fabergé going back to the great public events. So in 1900, for example, the Trans-Siberian Railway had been declared open. Now, the Trans-Siberian Railway had been conceived as this great engineering project, really to kickstart Russia's economy. And in many ways, it had succeeded. By 1900, Russia had the fastest growing economy in Europe, as it was rapidly industrializing. And here was the Trans-Siberian Railway, this amazing engineering achievement, linking Russia across 8 time zones. Obviously a suitable subject for an egg. This is one of the bigger ones, I should say. It's about 6 inches high altogether. And around the outside of the egg there, you've got a map showing the route of the railway. And then folded up within the egg, but I was showing it taken out of the egg here, is this golden train. And yes, that golden key that you can see there does do the job you might think it does. It is clockwork, this train. I always like talking about what the carriages are on the train are. You've got smoking, non-smoking, ladies, and a chapel. So everything you need for your voyage, for your journey across the Russian steppe. Of course, ladies didn't smoke, so you didn't need to divide them into smoking and non-smoking. At least that's my interpretation. 1903, we get another public event to celebrate. Back in 1703, Peter the Great had founded St. Petersburg. Founded St. Petersburg essentially, famously, to be Russia's window on the West. He wanted to modernize his country. He felt that Russia had to look westwards. So he had built this new capital city on marshland in the far northwest of Russia. Hundreds of thousands of people had died for Peter the Great to achieve that vision, but he had created this amazing, beautiful city, a suitable event to commemorate for its bicentenary 200 years later. And that's what you get here, the Peter the Great egg. Now, what you see here, the surprise inside the egg, is a miniature of a famous statue of Peter the Great. It actually rises up as you open the egg. And you get a few of my holiday snaps in this lecture, and here is one of them. Here is the original of that statue by the French sculptor Etienne Falconet, erected in honor of Peter the Great by the other great Tsar, or in this case, Tsarina Empress, Catherine the Great, on this enormous block of granite. Now, I always get my numbers wrong. It either took 300 men 4 years or 400 men 3 years to move that block of granite into position. But either way, it was a huge number of man years. And actually what you're seeing in this egg is this egg managing to remind Nicholas of his two great ancestors or predecessors at a time when his own reign was turning out to be very far from great indeed. In fact, more than that, we know, because Nicholas once told one of his courtiers, that of all of his ancestors, Peter the Great was the one he liked the least. He was actually nostalgic for Russia's more oriental past, for the days when the Tsar could behave like a true oriental potentate. Now, I'm sure he never said anything about this to Fabergé. He would have been far too polite to say, well, I don't particularly like Peter the Great, as he was presenting this egg as an Easter present to his wife. Nevertheless, I'd like to think that probably Fabergé did pick that up this same year that egg was presented in 1903, because that was the year when Nicholas and Alexandra invited all their guests to come to the Great Winter Palace Ball, which is one of the great seasons of the social calendar in the spring, dressed in the clothes, not in modern clothes, but in the clothes from the time of Tsar Alexis and his wife, that is to say, Peter the Great's father. And here we see Nicholas and Alexandra dressed as Alexis and his wife Martha, waiting to greet their guests at the Winter Palace. It's hard to find a picture of Alexandra where she's smiling, but she does have an excuse in this one. That headdress she was wearing was so heavy that she couldn't even move her head. So I like to think that Fabergé observed this and thought, yes, perhaps for next year's egg, we need to go for a more oriental theme, something that speaks to this. Now, where was he going to look to for that oriental inspiration? Well, to the Ouspensky Cathedral in Moscow, where Nicholas had been crowned, the famous onion domes of the Kremlin. And that's what inspired the egg planned for 1904, this one, the Ouspensky Cathedral egg. This is the biggest of them all, by the way. It's about a foot high altogether. It's also probably the least egg-like. It's almost as if in trying to produce something oriental, Fabergé's had to break his rules a bit. Now, you can look through the sides of that egg and you can see the carpets on the walls that you'd associate with an Orthodox cathedral. It's got bits of clockwork in it that play chants and chimes. You can almost smell the incense coming off it. It's a fabulous piece of work, of course. And we know it was planned for 1904 because that's the date it has on its bottom. But this egg was not presented in 1904 because in the meantime, events had intervened. Japan had been making threatening noises for a while on Russia's eastern seaboard, and in January 1904, they had invaded. Now, you might think, as Nicholas clearly did, what on earth could Japan do against the might of the Russian bear? I'm afraid it rapidly became clear that Japan could do an awful lot against the might of the Russian bear. Russia was fighting a war 8 time zones away. The Trans-Siberian Railway, for all its much vaunted opening, had not actually been completed yet. There was a section by Lake Baikal in Siberia where you had to get out and walk. Not so bad if it was winter and you could get on a sledge, but in autumn or spring, that meant trudging through mud. Russia rapidly began losing this war. The Russian response was to send round its North Sea fleet. Its Eastern fleet managed to get bottled up in, I think, in Port Arthur and Vladivostok. So it sent round its North Sea fleet, buying ships as it went, some of them small enough to go through the Suez Canal, most of them having to go around Cape of Good Hope, rendezvousing in the Indian Ocean, eventually arriving in the Straits of Tsushima between Japan and Korea, where the entire fleet was sunk in half an hour. Again, it was just a demonstration of incompetence, and Russia had to agree a humiliating peace a few months later. Now, all this poor prosecution of the war led to unrest at home. Russia, as I say, was urbanizing. It was starting to have an urban proletariat. In the course of 1904 and 1905, there started to be strikes all over Russia. In January 1905, it culminated in a demonstration of marchers going through the streets of St. Petersburg to present a list of really quite reasonable demands to the Tsar, who they thought was at the Winter Palace. The Tsar was not at the Winter Palace. He'd already left St. Petersburg. So instead, they were met by troops who fired at them. And again, the estimates of the number of people killed range from 200 or 300 to 2,000 or 3,000. Nothing new about this. This was traditionally about how the Tsarist regime dealt with dissent through repression. But what is new about it, of course, is I can show you a photograph of it. This took place in front of the world's press. So the events of what came to be called Bloody Sunday did not succeed in putting down the dissent in 1905. They actually added to it. So in the course of 1905, Russia came very close to revolution. There were all sorts of mini revolutions springing up all over Russia. And it only stepped back from the brink of revolution in October 1905, when Nicholas made a concession. Nicholas conceded that Russia should have a Duma, a parliament. And for many people, this was the great sign of hope, of Russia finally moving on the path to becoming a constitutional monarchy, like the one we have here in the UK. Fabergé was one of those people. For the rest of his life, he called himself an Octoberist. They were the people who celebrated the events of October 1905. And the other thing Nicholas does is, sort of as the counterpoint to that, as his first prime minister, he appoints a really capable man called Pierre Stolypin, who's to balance up, who is capable and ruthless in putting down all those mini insurrections all over Russia. So that calm eventually does return to Russia in the spring of 1906. And that egg planned for Easter 1904 is not in fact presented until Easter 1906. But in the meantime, Nicholas and Alexandra had had a very happy event. Here it is, the Tsarevich Alexis. Alexandra had finally given birth to an heir. And there he is looking particularly angelic. And I like showing this particular picture of him because, of course, the birth of an heir frees Fabergé. It means, once again, he is able to put pictures of the children on the eggs. And you can see this exact picture of Alexis being reproduced in the egg that Alexandra received for Easter 1908. It's called the Alexander Palace egg. And you can see there inside that egg, there, sitting inside that egg, is the miniature of the palace that gives its name. Nicholas and Alexandra had responded to the events of 04-05 by retreating from St. Petersburg, absolutely. They never lived in the Winter Palace again. Instead, they lived in this village outside St. Petersburg, about 10 miles outside St. Petersburg, called Tsarsky Selo, which is actually full of Russian palaces, royal palaces. And they lived in a relatively modest one there called the Alexander Palace, and concentrated on bringing their children up as well as possible. And by all accounts, they did do quite a good job at that. They were good parents. If that had been all that was required, that would have been fine. But of course, Nicholas was also meant to be an autocrat ruling Russia, and he had absented himself from his capital. He wasn't in touch with St. Petersburg society. His ministers had to come out every morning to take their orders from him. It was a faintly daft way to run a country. This isn't an entirely new idea for an egg either, because actually Marie Fedorovna had also received her miniature of a palace in an egg back in 1901. Here it is, the Gatchina Palace egg. Now, I'm just going to point out on this egg here, you can see sitting in the front there is this little miniature of a statue. Because when I went to Gatchina Palace, when I took my photograph of the front of Gatchina Palace, I wasn't quite able to get the statue in my photograph, but I did get its shadow, which is what you see here. This is my photograph of the front of Gatchina. When I was there, this is how it looked like round the back. Gatchina and indeed the Alexander Palace were far enough outside Leningrad, as St. Petersburg became, to mean that during the Second World War, they were both behind German lines during the siege of Leningrad. They were left by the end of the war as shells, shadows of their former selves, and indeed are still going through a process of restoration today, or at least were when I saw them. In a funny sort of, here's the Alexander Palace. Most of it's government offices these days. In a funny sort of way, I think those eggs almost capture the palaces in their heyday rather better than the buildings themselves do now. Following year, we get another, go back to the other Russian royal residence, the royal yacht, the Standard. This beautiful egg carved from rock crystal with a miniature of the boat inside. This is where Nicholas and Alexandra would go on holidays for 6 weeks every summer. And this is where they would let their hair down. Nicholas would lead mushrooming expeditions on uninhabited islands, that sort of thing. I said it's hard to find a picture of Alexandra where she's smiling, but here she is smiling on board the Standard. The children all made friends with sailors and officers on the boat. So the girls all made friends with the officers. Alexis acquired his own personal attendant from the Standard, this sailor called Derivenko, who would wheel him around on his own little miniature throne on the front of his bicycle. Alexis being absolutely celebrated as the heir and treated as such by everybody. And that's part of what you see allegorically, but nevertheless pretty clearly in this egg from 1910, the colonnade egg. Again, I always feel I need to emphasize with this, remember how small they are. This is much more jewel-like than this rather galumphing object you see in front of you here, you might think. And it's allegorical, but the meaning of this egg is pretty clear. You've got the boy at the top there, the little cherub at the top, looking down with rather lordly disdain at the 4 demure little girls seated around the outside of the egg there, the 4 little seraphs. Here are those 4 girls, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, just to remind ourselves really of how beautiful they were. And they often signed themselves collectively as Otma, their initials. And it's hard to think of themselves as individuals, but of course they all were. So Alexis being absolutely celebrated as the heir at a time when nobody knew his secret. And Alexis's secret, of course, was that he had haemophilia. It had become clear to his family fairly soon after he was born, but nobody knew outside the family until 1912. Now, haemophilia. What do we know about haemophilia? Well, you probably know that it's caused by a random mutation on the X chromosome, a recessive mutation on the X chromosome. It's recessive, so that means that for a woman to have haemophilia, she'd have to be very unlucky. Both her X chromosomes would have to have that mutation. But a woman can be a carrier of haemophilia without even knowing it. And if one of her X chromosomes has that mutation, then there is a 50% chance that any son of hers will exhibit the disease or the condition. And that was Alexis's bad luck. He was in that 50% chance. It seems to have originated as a random mutation in Queen Victoria herself. Several of her descendants went on to suffer from haemophilia. So, of course, we all know what haemophilia means, I think, probably. It means your blood doesn't clot properly. And we can all imagine, of course, that means when you cut yourself, it's hard to get that blood flow to stop. That's bad enough. But think about what happens when you bruise yourself. A bruise is essentially an internal bleed. And for most of us, of course, that is where it stops, with a bruise. Not for a haemophiliac. That blood carries on flowing internally and would do so in Alex until it filled his joints, until it was only the pressure of the blood itself that would bring the flow to an end. You can just imagine the agony he must have been in. You can imagine how his mother would have turned to any remedy imaginable to help her son. And that, of course, is what leads us to Rasputin. Now, as far as Nicholas and Alexandra were concerned, Rasputin was just a simple Siberian holy man. There's a long tradition of Siberian holy men in Russia, and Rasputin absolutely belonged to that tradition. There's also enough evidence from independent sources who bore Rasputin no love to show that whatever he did with Alexis, it clearly helped. Now, some people think he may have mesmerized him to take away the pain. There's another theory that I quite like, is that we do know absolutely that one of the things Rasputin said was keep him away from the doctors. Don't let the doctors bother him too much. Now, I think what a doctor would have done in the early 20th century faced the child in agony. they would, of course, have prescribed painkillers. What was the painkiller of choice at the time? Aspirin. And what do we now know about aspirin? It thins the blood. So simply by keeping Alexis away from doctors, Rasputin may have helped. But however he did it, he certainly did. And this, of course, started to give him a position at court. Now, none of this would have mattered if he was just that simple Siberian holy man. But Rasputin had a dark side as well. Most obviously, back in St. Petersburg, the Society of Women of St. Petersburg would worship Rasputin with their bodies as much as with their minds, all observed by Nicholas's own secret police. This all led to rumors about Rasputin's own relationship with Alexandra. Now, I am quite sure that whatever Boney M might have said, Rasputin was never a lover of the Russian queen. Nevertheless, it led to rumors, and it led to this dark state of affairs. Well, by now, Stolypin, that immensely capable prime minister, has absolutely tragically been assassinated. His replacement is a competent man, but without Stolypin's brilliance, and he's finding himself in the Duma having to defend his master's wife's relationship with the Siberian peasant. It is a faintly dark state of affairs for Russia to have got itself into. None of which, of course, you see any hint of in Fabergé's eggs, except for sort of this one. Here it is, the 15th anniversary egg. So 15 years after the coronation, presented to Alexandra in 1911. And what this egg consists of, its whole shell is made up of these amazingly detailed miniatures. Some of them pictures, as you can see, of Nicholas and the children. Others pictures of what Fabergé and his designers had decided were the great events of Nicholas's reign so far. And it's only when you look at that list of events, you think, what an uninspiring list it is. Things like Nicholas opening a bridge in honor of his father and things like that. In fact, there's only one event listed there of any real significance, and it's the one portrayed in this particular miniature here, Nicholas opening the Duma, this great event of hope for Fabergé and others. So this is the miniature as it occurs on the side of that egg. Here's a photograph taken of that same dais, that same scene, just before Nicholas steps onto the dais. And what you see in this photograph are, down the right-hand side of the room there, the newly elected members of the Duma, all in their 20th century clothes. And on the left-hand side, all of Nicholas's courtiers, still dressed in clothes from the times of Nicholas's great-grandfather. Things did not move on fast in the Russian court. The right-hand side staring at the left-hand side with such unabashed hatred, according to contemporary reports, that Marie Fedorovna, who was in that group in the corner of the room there, had to leave it in tears. And that sets us up for what the Duma became. Under Stolypin, it did achieve some good things, in particular in relation to land reform. But after his assassination, it descended. And there was really only one person to blame for that, and that is Nicholas himself. He had never really wanted to concede the existence of the Duma. He saw it as his duty to pass on to his son the same autocracy that he had inherited from his father. He didn't have the imagination, really, to realize what might happen as a result. And so from about 1911, 1912 onwards, we do see the Duma descending into little more than a talking shop and a focus for dissent. And we see the strikes starting to spring up around Russia. We see Russia getting back on the path towards revolution. Still time, however, for Fabergé to produce some fabulous eggs. Here is the Romanov tercentenary egg, given to Alexandra in 1913. So back in 1613, Michael Romanov, the first of the line, had been offered the throne by a group of nobles who wanted to bring an end to the so-called time of troubles the chaos into which Russia descended after the death of Ivan the Terrible. And so around the outside of that egg, you've got miniatures of every Romanov Tsar from since Michael down to Nicholas, you can see in the middle of the egg there. Inside that egg is a double hemisphere. One hemisphere showing a map of the territory taken over by Michael Romanov back in 1613, already huge. The other hemisphere showing the territory taken over, ruled by Nicholas in 1913, unimaginably vast. It's common to speak about these things in terms of the size of Wales. I'm never quite sure why. But in terms of the size of Wales, for every year the Romanovs had ruled Russia, their territory had increased by 2 Waleses. The Russian Empire had increased by 600 Waleses in those 300 years. And of course, every precious and semi-precious stone on that egg, mined from within the borders of the Russian Empire. It is a fabulous egg, but it is not the best egg given in 1913, in my opinion. Because in my opinion, the best egg given in 1913 was actually that year given to Marie Fedorovna. And it's an egg that was designed by one of Fabergé's few female designers, a woman called Alma Pill. And I'm going to read you, except I've lost my reading. I'm going to read you a little, well, I'm not going to be able to read it to you. I'm having to remember my reading about it, about the design of that egg. And the reason I always try to read it is because I have to make clear that part of what I'm reading is not my words, but somebody else's words. Because it starts off with Alma marrying Nicholas Clay in 1912, but being allowed to continue as a designer since she wasn't much good in the kitchen. That's her daughter's words, and I just need to emphasize they're hers rather than mine. So she was working as a designer at Fabergé when an order came in from a Dr. Emmanuel Nobel, the nephew of the inventor of dynamite and himself a fabulously wealthy oil magnate, for 40 small pieces, preferably brooches, of a value so small they were not to be understood as bribes. And that's when Alma looked up and noticed a pattern of icicles on a window pane and thought, yes, potential for an icicle theme for a piece of jewelry. So at a dinner party given by Dr. Nobel a few weeks later, the ladies all received their own little miniature icicle made of rock crystal and diamonds. Now that makes me think I would have liked to have been a guest at one of Dr. Nobel's dinner parties. But that idea for a piece of jewelry made on a winter theme had potential for expression in something larger, in the egg that, also designed by Alma Pill, that Marie Fedorovna received in 1913. And I just think this is fabulous. It's called the winter egg. So what you've got there is an egg carved from rock crystal. The rock crystal's been frosted, but it's then sitting on a plinth of rock crystal, which is being polished. So the egg itself looks like a winter fog sitting on melting ice. And inside that winter fog, what you can see the surprise there is this basket of spring anemones, enameled flowers. You open the egg, take the basket out from the winter fog, and spring has sprung. It is just a wonderful allegorical representation of Easter. And I think it's worth pausing for a moment here to think. Here we are, we're in 1913 now, almost 30 years after that first egg I showed you, and we're still getting the most remarkable creations year after year after year. Now, you can say what you like about the Fabergé eggs, about them being playthings of a decadent court and all of that. And it's all true, of course. Nevertheless, you also do have to recognize that as a sequence of creativity, the Fabergé eggs really are something else. Following year, we get two more marvelous eggs. This is the one that Marie Fedorovna received. It used to contain within it a clockwork miniature of the Empress Catherine in a sedan chair. I say used to because it's been lost, so that's something to look out for. And we know what Marie Fedorovna's reaction to it was, because she wrote to her sister back in England about it. She said, Fabergé brought me the egg, and I told him you are a genius. And then this is the egg that Alexandra received that year. And again, it's fabulous. Again, it's designed by Alma Pill. This time she was inspired by seeing her mother-in-law working on a piece of needlepoint. And that's what it looks like, of course, a bit of embroidery, stitching. It's called the mosaic egg because that's what it is. It's a lattice work of platinum with all these individual precious and semi-precious stones set into it to create this wonderful effect. And sitting inside it, as you can see, pictures of the children. That's what Alexandra got in her eggs as often as not these days. So this is Easter 1914. One last picture of the family taken that summer, essentially just to remind ourselves really of how beautiful they were. And then, well, in July 1914, by the Russian calendar, August 1914 by ours, of course, the Archduke Ferdinand is assassinated, well, in July for both of us, actually. But in July, in August, Germany declares war on Russia. Germany has declared war on Russia and France simultaneously. It's part of it. Its grand strategic plan is that Russia is going to take so long to mobilize because of all the strikes and unrest that Germany will be able to knock out France before having to worry about Russia on its eastern front. Now, Russia actually takes Germany by surprise with the speed of its mobilization. There's a huge outpouring of patriotic fervor in response to the mobilization, in response to the declaration of war. Germany has to react to that by transferring 25 divisions from its western front to its eastern front far sooner than it wanted to. Possibly as a result, gets bogged down in that war of attrition on the western front, And so from that point of view, you could say that Russia eventually ended up winning the Allies at the First World War. Nevertheless, on the Eastern Front, things went terribly for the Russians. They lost battle after battle, huge numbers of casualties coming into St. Petersburg, or Petrograd, as it changed its name to stop having such a Germanic name. The Romanov family's response was to turn their palaces into hospitals and for all the older Romanov women to enroll as Red Cross nurses. So here are Alexandra and the two older daughters, Olga and Tatiana, along with a friend of Alexandra's, dressed in their Red Cross uniforms. And that's what you see being commemorated in the Fabergé eggs for 1915. Now, you might ask why on earth Fabergé eggs were produced at all during this war. And I find it hard to answer that question because they hadn't been back in 04, 05. I think the simple answer is that it had got automatic by now. Nobody thought to stop them. There's no doubt that the last few eggs that Fabergé produced are much simpler by comparison with what went before. So here is the Red Cross egg that Alexandra received that year. It's got pictures of Olga and Tatiana in their nurse's uniform. Open the egg, and there is a classic Orthodox icon of Christ breaking down the grates of hell, the harrowing of hell. Russia was going through hell at the time. This is really the only year when they received eggs that could be described as companion pieces. Marie Fedorovna, you won't be surprised to hear, was patron of the Russian Red Cross. So she received an egg that contained miniatures of all the Romanov women, by then working as nurses. By the following year, Nicholas has taken the ultimately fatal decision that as Tsar, he should be at the front, at headquarters, in nominal charge of the army. Now, he wasn't foolish enough to think he should actually take charge of the army. He left that to his generals. Nevertheless, he was associating himself personally with the Russian army and thereby fatally undermining his prestige as Tsar as the Russian army continued to suffer defeat after defeat. None of this was quite so clear in Easter 1916. The army had responded to Nicholas appointing himself as its commander-in-chief by, perhaps not unnaturally, awarding him its highest honour for gallantry, the Cross of St. George. And that's what you see here, the Cross of St. George egg presented to Marie Fedorovna that year. Very simple egg, really simple enamel. And you can see that little flap lifts up of the Cross of St. George to reveal a miniature of Nicholas underneath. And then this is the last egg received by Alexandra Fedorovna that same year, the steel military egg, it's called. I've shown you all these fabulous eggs, and this is the last one, and it almost feels like a blow in the solar plexus, really. Piece of kitsch, I always think when I see this egg. The original invoice description for that egg describes the steel as blackened, and perhaps when it was blackened, it wasn't quite so in your face as what you see here, resting on its steel artillery shells. You can see the miniature, the surprise inside that egg, a little miniature on an easel of Nicholas at the front, looking at maps with his generals, accompanied, you might just see it on the right-hand side there, by Alexis, by his son. Nicholas had thought it would be a good father-son bonding experience for Alexis to come to headquarters with him, and it was. Except Alexis was also a sick child. Nicholas was spending his nights nursing his sick child, they shared a tent, while at the same time during his days, he was meant to be commander-in-chief of this army. Again, it's just strange decision-making. But the really poor thing about Nicholas absenting himself from Petrograd to be at headquarters, which was 800 kilometers away, was it meant he had to leave somebody else behind to be his eyes and ears in Petrograd. He was still nominally autocrat of Russia. Not just nominally, he was autocrat of Russia. There was only one person Nicholas trusted for that, and that, of course, was his wife, Alexandra. And Alexandra, by now, was really almost enthralled to Rasputin. Here's a contemporary caricature. You can see it in Alexandra's letters to Nicholas. She writes to him every day while he's at headquarters. She says things like, "I am sending you Rasputin's comb, because I think having his comb will help you make better decisions." And there's no doubt that Nicholas, advised by Alexandra, advised by Rasputin, makes the most disastrous decisions in that last year, 1916. This was a year when Russia needs stability, and Nicholas gets through prime minister after prime minister, war minister after war minister, minister of the interiors come and go. Russia has no stability at all. Towards the end of the year, a group of nobles decide that Rasputin is the problem, and they murder him in very bloody circumstances. Here's a picture of Alexandra in mourning for him that winter. And then the real problem is that by now the bread isn't getting through to Petrograd. The trains aren't running properly. And so when it starts to warm up in February 1917, people come out on the streets of Petrograd to protest. Nicholas is back at headquarters by now, but he knows what to do. He wires to the head of the Petrograd garrison, telling him to put down the dissent. The trouble is, the Petrograd garrison has changed since the 10 years or so since it last put down dissent. It's either made up of veterans from the front who have seen the incompetence of their officers at first hand, or it's made up of raw recruits who are not inclined to fire on their cousins. In short, the army in Petrograd does not put down the dissent, it joins it. And from that point on, there's no doubt about what's going to happen. Here is a picture actually of those crowds on the street on that first day, around that statue I showed you a miniature of earlier on in this lecture. When they disperse towards the end of the day under their own steam, somebody has scrawled hippo on the bottom of that statue, just a sign of lèse-majesté, I suppose. Nicholas has lost the army. Within a week, he abdicates, not just for himself, but also for his son Alexis, because he can't bear the idea of being separated from Alexis. There's then this odd period when Nicholas and the family are all under house arrest in the Alexander Palace, just outside Petrograd. It's for their own, and there's a provisional government that's moving towards having free and fair elections in Russia. That's the plan. Then for their own safety as much as anything else, the royal family has moved further inland to Siberia, to the governor's palace in Tobolsk. Here's a picture of Nicholas and Alexis sawing wood in the garden of that palace in the summer of 1916, or towards the end of the summer of 1916. And then in November 1917, Russia has its second revolution, and that's when the Bolsheviks under Lenin take charge. And from that point on, I'm afraid there's really no doubt about what is eventually going to happen to Nicholas and the family. And it's a fate that they, of course, meet elsewhere in Siberia, here in this basement in Ekaterinburg in July 1918, when the entire family is shot. And on that very sad note, I'm afraid I think I have to end my lecture.
Thank you. Absolutely fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. The links between those fabulous, fabulous eggs and the Romanov family and their history is just brilliant, Toby. And I'm sorry we had the earlier glitches, but the whole thing was...
They were my technical problems, not yours. I'm just sorry about them.
Well, I can assure you that the recording will lose those technical glitches, but I'm sure the audience thoroughly enjoyed it. And although it's a little late, I'm going to ask if you could tolerate and a couple of questions, perhaps just for the next 10 minutes. If people would like to ask a question, you can put it in the chat. You can actually sort of physically wave at me, or you can use your reaction hand, and we'll look out for you. Gerald, I wondered if you wanted to ask your questions that you had right at the beginning. Let's start with you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it was incredible. I just was riveted because I love royal history, Romanovs, everything about that. And I guess my only question is, what immediately happened to the eggs? You know, did Russians revolution, they stormed the palace, so where did they go?
Well, there is a whole story. There is a whole story there, of course, and we are talking about 50 individual eggs. I mean, the short answer is, of course, you've got the eggs given to Marie Fedorovna, and you've got the eggs given to Alexandra. The eggs given to Alexandra, because, as I said, they were put under house arrest quite quickly, all of her eggs were secured. Marie Fedorovna, it's a much murkier picture. Some of them were, insofar as there are missing eggs still, they are all ones that belong to Marie Fedorovna. And what happened to most of the eggs, something like over 40 of them, and we can't be exactly sure how many, it turns out most of them were sent for safekeeping to the Kremlin. But that only became clear in the early 1920s when the Kremlin started looking at what it had. I mean, there's a whole other story there. But yes,
the jewelry and everything.
And then you get Stalin wanting to sell them abroad for foreign exchange. It's why you get quite a lot coming to the West towards the end of the 1920s.
Thank you.
Anybody else would like to ask a question? I think you've told us so much, Toby. It's quite hard to think what else we could ask you.
Normally people ask where they can see them. The easiest place in London is the Queen's Gallery by Buckingham's Palace. There's always a Fabergé corner there, and she owns 3 of the Fabergé eggs, all bought by Queen Mary.
And if people do have access to London, I don't know if you were here when I mentioned this before, but there's an exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum starting on the 20th of November. It's called Fabergé in London, Romance and Revolution. And two of the eggs that you showed us tonight, the Romanov tercentenary egg and the Alexander Palace egg, are going to be part of that exhibition.
I think they're going to have a lot more. They're going to have a lot more than that. Actually, it's going to be a really good collection of eggs on display. I think Watsky's, I know, are helping put it together, and I've heard that they've got quite a lot coming.
Great. So we look forward to that. Anybody else would like to say anything right now? Because if not, I will just thank Toby for an absolutely.
Yes, please.
Sorry, Sharon?
Yes, very quickly. I was very fortunate many years ago to work for Thomas Good of Mayfair, and they have a very strong connection with Russia and their archives. And I was privileged to see some of the original archives when he met Fabergé.
That's interesting.
Yeah, very, very fascinating.
I have to say, I'd love to talk to you about Thomas Good sometimes, because I've always wondered how on earth it survives, but that's another matter.
Yeah,
it's a fabulous shop.
Thank you. It's fascinating. Thank you.
So it just remains me to thank you, Toby, and people can go on enjoying the eggs wherever they happen to be, in Richmond, Virginia, or in central London, the Queen's Gallery, whatever. But thank you for your absolutely masterful exposition and all the beautiful, beautiful photographs. And one of the advantages of Zoom is that I managed to sort of practically have my nose on the screen to get the detail of some of those exquisite eggs. So, Toby, thank you very much. And we can clap when you can't hear us, except for me. But thank you, and much appreciated. And there's lots of appreciation in the chat. So thank you.
It's lovely. Thank you. And I'll give you all a wave. That's what you do at the end of Zoom calls.